Welcome back to Between the Edits. My name is Grace, and today I have the joy of speaking with Thomas Salerno. He is a narrative nonfiction writer for kids and teens, and he recently debuted a children's nonfiction book called The Riddle of the Tungstones. So I'd love to pass it over to you, Thomas, and tell us a little bit more about yourself and your debut novel or book.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I've been a writer pretty much full time since 2020. That may be a familiar year for everyone because it was the year of the pandemic, and like many people, I was working another job at the time and then lost it because of the shutdowns. I was actually working in the American Museum of Natural History in New York City.
Ooh.
I have a degree in anthropology, and I have worked with both fossils and human remains in a museum setting. But unfortunately, because the museums were the first places in New York City to shut down during the pandemic, but providentially, I had begun writing for online outlets about a month before all the craziness happened. So I'm like, you know what? Why don't I just start doing more of that? And I was writing. I am Roman Catholic, so I was writing for a lot of Catholic outlets, including Bishop Robert Barron's Word on Fire apostolate and other mostly Roman Catholic, but also broadly Christian websites. And I've always been kind of a writer since my youth. I've always been creating stories or just having a toy typewriter and writing on that. And so it just felt kind of natural for me to just kind of, use my passion for words as something I could fall back on when I had nothing else to do. And it turned out later I caught the bug of writing for kids. And in 2023, my good friends at Word on Fire accepted my debut children's nonfiction book for their votive children's book imprint. And I saw The Riddle of the Tungstones released last year, and I'm very excited. It is a biography about Nicholas Steno, who was a saintly scientist from Denmark. He was an anatomist, but also did pioneering work in geology and fossils, which I'm very passionate about. So he's been a hero of mine for a long time. So I was really excited to tell his story for a younger audience.
That's beautiful. There's so much there that I want to get into. I'm gonna take us back just a little bit. One of the questions I love asking is, did a love of reading or a love of writing come first for you?
It's hard to say. I would probably have to say reading. My mom always read to me. And being a little boy who was interested in dinosaurs, they were usually dinosaur books. And so I would have her read these books over and over again. I can't remember a time when I wasn't reading or being read to. So I would have to say that came first. I think the first time I knew I wanted to be a writer was probably when I read Michael Crichton's Jurassic Park. When I was way too young, because that's an adult book with lots of adult language in it. But I read it in the fourth grade, and was caught many times hiding under the covers with my flashlight, finishing
The classic
Jurassic
scene.
Park. Yeah, the classic scene, finishing that and its sequel, The Lost World, reading them over and over again. And, this idea that like somebody could be a novelist for a living. I'm like, wait, you can write books about dinosaurs for a living? And so I think that was like the first time I was aware that like author was a job description. And I've always kind of nurtured this dream of having a published book, ever since then.
Amazing. So, but for your, schooling, you did, you said anthropology, correct?
Yeah, I went to Stony Brook University on Long Island, where I live, and they have a great anthropology program. My background is in paleoanthropology, so the study of primate and human fossils.
So you pursued that primarily and kind of always had this dream of being an author in the background. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I would basically say
Uh-huh.
that. Yeah, it was always kind of running in the background of my
Right.
mind that I wanted to
Mhm.
publish a book someday, but I was hoping to either become a paleontologist myself or to work, in a museum setting
Mhm.
with fossils, like as as a fossil preparator, which is someone who gets fossils ready for exhibition or research, or someone like a collections manager who handles the thousands and thousands of objects that are in a museum's collection. The American Museum was my Disney World growing up, so I would beg my parents to take me there. So that was always a setting that I relished being in and wanted to work in.
Right. And it sounds like it has fostered a lot of the things that you now, enjoy writing about, and all of that knowledge kind of makes its way into your writing here. So then you're working in the museum and you're doing that, but then COVID happens and you have the opportunity to, like you said, fall back on your writing, but actually realize a dream you've had. So how did
Yep.
you get into writing for these Catholic outlets? And did you have to learn or teach yourself how to write in that particular way? Had you had previous experience with that type of writing? Walk me through it.
I went to Catholic school for high school, so I had, a background in the theology, and I read a lot of spiritual books, and I'm a
Mm,
voracious reader, still am, and I've read a lot of, like church documents and books on theology and spirituality, lives of the saints, especially. I love
mm,
biographies. And history, and so I'm always reading lives of the saints and books about church history. When I started, I was actually writing about the intersection of faith and pop culture
mm.
um, for a website of a Catholic comic book publisher called Voyage Comics and Publishing. And they ran a blog at the time, and my first articles were writing about pop culture, superheroes, and spirituality for them. And those were my first bylines. I'll always be grateful to Philip Kozlowski, who's the CEO there, for giving me my first break as a writer. And when X was called Twitter, I was very active there, and I just made you know, they seemed like chance connections at the time, but they were really providential connections. I ended up connecting with someone on the publishing team for Word on Fire who happens to live in my town,
Ah,
Matt Becklow, and we became great friends. And he always encouraged me to submit to their online journal, Evangelization and Culture Online. So I started. After a few rejections, I started writing for them. My first article for them was about Jurassic Park, the film. It so it all comes back. It was
right.
called something like Jurassic Park as a parable for the modern age, and
Mm.
that was my first article with them. And so I've been writing with them on and off ever since for the blog. And so through my connections there, when Matt Becklow heard I was working on this children's book manuscript, he encouraged me to submit it to Haley Stewart, who's the head of their children's book imprint, Votive. And so I can really see how these, providential
Mm.
connections and meeting with different people, was slowly laying the groundwork for realizing that dream I had had for years.
Oh, I love it. So, okay, maybe a bit of a small fun tangent here, but I have to ask. So, as somebody who loved the actual Jurassic Park novels, how did you feel about the movie adaptation?
So I saw the movie first. I was
Okay.
5 years old, and that movie rocked my world. As a little
Hmm.
kid who loved dinosaurs, that was like the best thing ever. Um, I love the books in a different way. They're very different from especially from the first film. I believe that the first film, though, does an excellent job of capturing the essence of the book while
Okay.
making it fit for film, because film is such a different storytelling medium from
Absolutely.
novels. And I feel like the novel is very much a techno thriller, and there's a lot of info dumps
Hmm.
where Michael Crichton will give you all of this technical information about genetics, about computer coding, about all this, about statistics, about chaos theory, all this different stuff. And the movie is more of a science fiction action adventure flick.
Hmm.
And I think it does that really well while maintaining the core parable of the book, which is essentially a retelling of Frankenstein.
Right.
This scientists creating something that they cannot control that ends up, becoming essentially a monster. In the film, the line that perfectly captures the essence of the film is when Ellie Sattler, the paleobotanist, is arguing with John Hammond, the man who created Jurassic Park, and Hammond saying it's all right once we because he she talks about how Jurassic Park was an illusion. And he's
Mm,
like, no, once we have control again, she interrupts him and says, you never had control. That's the illusion. And
mm.
so that illusion of being able to control nature, to control, to play God, which has always
Absolutely.
been the
Yep.
temptation since Babel, to play God, to take his place. That's the central theme of the book. And since the movie tells that story in its own unique way, um, I just love the first movie. The second movie is also very dear to my heart. The ones after that get progressively dumber and sillier and kind of
Right.
move away from the kind of very scary horror sci-fi movie that the first one is. But I appreciate them all in some
Right.
way.
Different ways. You're right. They're
Even though
different
that
mediums.
even though I've been disappointed with some of the more recent ones because of how much I feel like they've become a parody of the original film, but
Absolutely.
that happens with Hollywood franchises.
Yeah. I mean, I was also going to say that that was my case. So we actually, I don't remember how it came up, but just this past weekend, my fiance and I were talking, and Jurassic Park came up, and I think he quoted a line from the movie, and we both had realized that like I don't think we've ever like actually sat down and watched the original movies, and so like now we have to do that. But one of my reasons was I was like, I think I remember seeing like bits and pieces of it, but I think it was one of those movies where I was too scared of the dinosaurs to sit and watch it all. So you're
Yeah.
right. I mean that those very first movies, they have that kind of like intentional scary aspect to it.
Yeah, and they use a lot of practical effects, which
Yes.
heightens the realism aspect. Like some of those dinosaurs, like they look real, which is part of
Hmm.
and they pioneered a lot of incredible filmmaking technologies. It was such a
Hmm.
groundbreaking film. But Steven Spielberg was one of my heroes growing up. I
Yeah.
thought that was another thing where I'm like, he has the coolest job in the world, I thought. And for a while,
Hmm.
I was running around with my dad's VHS-C camcorder, you know, filming my dinosaur action figures, trying to recreate Jurassic Park.
Yeah. Which is so fun because I think there might be some people out there that have some misconceptions about being a Catholic and being able to still enjoy pop culture and things like that.
Hmm.
And so one of the things you talked about is like, I think people might be surprised to learn that there are like Catholic publishers out there that specialize in comic books, like you mentioned,
Yep.
and that your first article for Word on Fire had to do with Jurassic Park, as being a parable for these important things that we're discussing. And so I would love to hear your thoughts on that. This idea that some Catholics might have, or people who are not Catholics but have preconceived notions about Catholicism, that you can't enjoy any pop culture. What are your thoughts on that?
Right. Yeah. I've encountered some of that. Um, and I feel like it is a misconception about the purpose of art, I think, almost,
Hmm.
or storytelling, and how yes, there are a lot of narratives being pushed in modern storytelling from, say, the institutions of Hollywood or big publishing
Hmm.
that are counter to, a Catholic worldview. But that doesn't mean that I think you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You can't
Hmm.
throw out all contemporary storytelling and just say, I'm not going to engage with it. Because people who are the mission field, people today are engaging with it.
Right.
And I think we have to understand what makes these stories so powerful to people.
Hmm.
Much like in the early church, they had to discover what was so powerful about pagan mythology
Mm.
that, that people were responding to it, you
Hmm.
know. And the church fathers talk about finding the seeds of the word, they call it, in pagan mythology, in pagan storytelling. St. Paul tells us to test everything and hold fast to what is good. And
Hmm.
that's basically been my marching orders when I explore movies and novels, even, like a lot of them secular, comic books.
Mm-hmm.
I really try to test everything and hold fast to what is good because so much of modern storytelling is predicated on a Christian worldview because we've had 20
Yes.
centuries of
Mm-hmm.
church history. Even secular storytelling can't seem to get away from including things that maybe even they're not conscious of
Mm-hmm.
that are like, for example, like Frankenstein, like I mentioned, Mary Shelley was not an orthodox Christian by any stretch, but Frankenstein is permeated with this idea that to play God is to tread on extremely perilous ground, you
Right.
know. And so, we can find in not just classic literature, but popular literature and popular stories. I've always said that things like superheroes and Star Wars, they're the modern mythology, just like
Mm-hmm.
the popular stories of Hercules and Theseus and all this other stuff where like the Roman like elites didn't believe in the gods and demigods and heroes in the way that popular people
Right.
appreciated these stories. So like this is like these things are the new mythology. And I've always said that I try to baptize the new mythology in a way and take out the just like the church fathers baptized the old mythology, and monks painstakingly copied these old pagan stories. So the ones that we have that survive are due to Christian monks who clearly appreciated these stories, even
Mm-hmm.
though, they didn't believe in the pagan religion. They were Christians. So I think that it would be a shame if we threw out all of modern storytelling just because some of the trappings of it
Right. Mhm.
may rub us the wrong way as Christians.
Yes. Well, and you make the point, test everything. It also makes me think of to be set apart from the world, but you can't divorce yourself from the world. And
Mm.
it also makes me think that there's the concept of we're all looking for something, right? And from a Christian worldview, it's very clear that the classic, you have the God-shaped hole in your heart, right? And only God can fill it. But as humans, we look to things like religion, we look to things like art for those things. And so I think part of what you're talking about there is if you were testing everything and you're looking at the world and you're exposing yourself to all these different, mythologies like you were talking about, those are indications of what people are looking for. And if you can find what they're looking for, you can lead them to the truth of what's going to get them there. So it's kind of helping
Yes, that's
diagnose from that
exactly right.
perspective.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Beautiful.
Yeah, exactly. To try and lead people like, you are searching for something deeper,
Hmm.
and so let me lead you to that deeper thing that you're looking for. Yeah.
Hmm. Amazing.
We're going to take a quick break from the conversation so I can tell you a little bit about a great product. I want to tell you about the Tertulia for Authors website builder. As someone who made their own website when I first started freelance editing, I can tell you that it took hours of frustration to end up with a website that had half the functionality of the Tertulia for Authors website builder. This resource is specifically designed for authors, whether you're published or not. It's easily customizable, incredibly user-friendly, and puts vital marketing tools at the fingertips of authors, like blogs, event calendars, reader magnets, and email lists. And it's really affordable. So if you're an author looking to establish a website for the first time, or an author who already has a website but is looking to switch to a more manageable software, use the affiliate link in the description to sign up with Tortilla for Authors. Using this link does help support the podcast and is greatly appreciated. Now back to the podcast.
So now let's transition a little bit into you've got this desire to write. You're being, writing for these like Catholic outlets. You have this job that you love in a museum in the setting that you always wanted, but then COVID happens. You realize this writing thing is like, maybe this is my opportunity. And so you write your debut children nonfiction book, The Riddle of the Tungstones. I want to start with why the kids and teens age range.
That's a funny story because that's all due. This book would not exist without my mom. And in fact, the book is dedicated to her. She is the one who opened my eyes to the fact that I potentially had this talent for writing for a younger
Mhm.
audience. She saw in me what I couldn't see in
Mm.
myself. I was a frustrated novelist for many years trying to write the big, important Catholic sci-fi novel or fantasy novel or whatever. And I was just stuck. I was a serial non-finisher. I wasn't creating any finished manuscripts. My world building was going nowhere. I was frustrated. And she kept telling me, you should write a kid's book. And specifically, you should write one about Nicholas Steno, the first paleontologist, that guy who you love so much. And I blew her off. I was like, Mom, I don't know anything about writing for kids. I don't know what you're talking about. And then she reminded me that, when I was in grade school and junior high, I had been so into dinosaurs that like my kindergarten and first grade teachers would always invite me back during the dinosaur unit to give a presentation to the
Oh my
younger
God.
kids. She's like, you have this way of communicating these things to kids that makes their eyes light up and makes them fascinated. And I'm like, I don't know. No, it's not going to work. Eventually I caved and I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
you know what? Maybe she's right. I have to do this. And so, yeah, I was inspired by the Catholic Writers Guild online conference, which is every year. It's always in February, I think. So it was going to happen, and they were going to have pitch sessions. And so I think it was about October of 22. I'm like, you know what? I want to finish this book and have it ready to pitch by February. And so I just did it. I put aside almost all my other projects and pounded out, several drafts of this until
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was ready. And I brought it to the pitch sessions. I found a publisher who was interested enough to want the entire manuscript, so I had made a successful pitch. They weren't. It did not end up be the publisher that I ended up landing with, but that was fine.
Mm-hmm.
It gave me the experience of pitching and the
Right.
experience of then writing a book proposal. And so eventually, as I said, my friend Matt Becklow found out I had this manuscript, and he's like, "Oh, submit it to Word on Fire Votive. Do it." And so, yeah, and so I kind of just landed in in writing children's books. But once I started doing it, I'm like, I caught the bug. I can't see myself
Mm.
not doing this.
What do you think was the thing about it that made it a bug for you, right? So like what do you think that draws you so closely to that? Is it just that you have this natural inclination towards communicating to this age group and because it was so formative for you at that same age, or why do you think that this feels like your niche?
I think what you said about that this was the formative thing for me when I was a kid, because I was also a quirky kid in that I read a lot of nonfiction.
Mm.
And so, like, I decided that, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to write the kinds of books that I would have loved as a 10-year-old that I don't see in the market
Right.
today.
Mm-hmm.
There's kids nonfiction. A lot of it is picture books or like more heavy, textbook kind of things. And I'm like,
Right.
no, I want something that can either be a chapter book or Riddle of the Tungstones does not have chapters, but it's substantial. It's a 4,000 word book.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted something that was, of longer than picture book length with some challenging vocabulary, but also with a glossary and vocab call out boxes that
Mm-hmm.
help the kids through in understanding some of this, because I was an advanced reader as a kid and
Mm-hmm.
I was not deterred by heavy vocabulary. I was challenged by it. So
Right.
I just feel that there's this opening in the market that's missing these kinds of nonfiction books about science, about history, about fossils and dinosaurs, and it was just missing,
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought like that was my mission was to just create the kind of books I would have loved when I was 10.
So for somebody who may not be super familiar with it, how would you describe narrative nonfiction?
So narrative nonfiction is primarily about telling a story. So in that way, it's like fiction because it has a narrative. It's not just a dry recitation of facts. It's not a
Uh-huh.
textbook. Textbook is not narrative nonfiction. Narrative nonfiction is something like Hidden Figures, for
Mm,
example, which
I was about to
became a
say.
movie.
I was gonna say
Yeah.
like a
So
movie
like
reference would be like a biopic.
right, like a biopic, exactly.
Mhm.
Narrative nonfiction are often biographies, or they're about a section of a person's life a historical figure's life which is significant in some way. Or sometimes narrative nonfiction is actually autobiographical
Mm,
or almost like memoir. I've seen deep sea divers like put out narrative nonfiction books, like like My Adventures at the Bottom of the Ocean or something
right.
like that.
Hmm.
Or I've seen astronauts write narrative nonfiction. So that's almost like memoir, but it's like, but they also bring in the science of the rocket science and
Right.
the orbital mechanics of how this all works, and so like it's a way of presenting nonfiction, so the reader still learns something about
Hmm.
the world. And I would really say that narrative nonfiction is meant to inspire curiosity. I always like narrative nonfiction books that have a further resources section in the back,
Yes.
that allows you to dive deeper into some of this stuff if you've caught the bug for wanting to learn more about this topic. Honestly, it shouldn't have been a surprise to me because a narrative nonfiction is a lot of what I read,
Hmm.
to this day. So that's how I would classify it in the broader nonfiction space.
Okay, perfect. And so we actually got connected through Substack, and you have a newsletter on there called Page Turning, which talks a lot about you delving into this specific genre. But you also made a post recently talking about how you found a feeling of purpose in addressing for children the intersection of faith and science. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that. Obviously, you love science. You have a lot of career history with that, and now you're integrating it into your writing in a way that makes that approachable for kids. So, where did that come from, and how did you find out that that was a passion for you?
I think when I was 12 or 13, I encountered a lot of children's books written by fundamentalists that were
Mm,
talking about this topic. And honestly, I was very troubled by them as a kid, as a child that was very curious, that was into science and paleontology and fossils. I had never come across anything before saying that like modern science is completely inimical and antagonistic to Christianity, and the Christian should have nothing to do with modern science. And I was shaken by that because I couldn't find any Catholic resources aimed at young readers responding to this narrative, and
mhm.
I didn't even know where to look for such resources. So I spent many agonized years as a teenager trying to reconcile, well, like where there's all this Christian books and literature saying this is against what we believe, yet I've never found that to be true in my own faith experience. I just wished I had had a resource at that age to
Mhm.
explain to me that, as Pope John Paul II once said in his encyclical Faith and Reason, that faith and reason are two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of the truth. And certainly, scientism as an ideology can be antagonistic towards theism and Christianity. But that is a philosophy. That's not science
Mhm.
itself. That's not the scientific method. Is simply a way of knowing that is different but complementary to philosophy and theology. And I just wish I had had a book at that age. I did end up finding some books, but they were written primarily for adults. One of them was Kenneth Miller's, he's a cell biologist. His book, Finding Darwin's God,
Mm,
was
yes.
foundational for me. I must have read it when I was 16 or 17 or so. But that book put a lot of my, not so much doubts, but just conflicts to rest, because I
Right.
thought that, like, oh, well, maybe the atheists are right. Maybe Christianity needs to be put aside to do serious science, because I didn't find these fundamentalist arguments very serious, and I thought, are these the authentic Christian arguments? And it turns out they're not.
Right.
Fundamentalism is a uniquely American and very recent phenomenon. It does not represent the 2,000-year thought tradition of Christianity. Learning later in my 20s how much the Middle Ages laid the groundwork for the later scientific revolution in the 1600s. My confirmation saint is Albert the Great, who
I
was
was going to ask you that.
yeah, an encyclopedist and kind of proto-scientist in his own
Mm,
way. So, I've always had this connection to both him and then to Blessed Nicholas Steno, who, really laid the groundwork for my own field and
mhm,
this idea that the Earth has a history that we can know just by looking at the rocks under our feet.
mhm. That's beautiful. It makes me think. So I attended public school growing up, and I think the idea of separation of church and state really, created the ground for this fundamentalist movement, like you're talking about. And so that,
Mm.
I mean, that was me for the longest time. I thought that religion and science could not coexist, and so I didn't become a Christian and then a Catholic until much later in life. And one of the things that kind of really first confronted that for me was I was in college studying biology, and my best friend, who I met in my very first class of college, which was a biology class, very devout Christian, and she had something about her, and also my brother-in-law, who at the time was my sister's boyfriend, also very devout Christian, also very intelligent, loved science. I was like, I'm being uncharitable in my thoughts towards them because I'm like, these are very smart people. They do very well in all these science-based classes, and yet they also are Christians. And I always thought that those were just like incompatible. And I know that they're smart, so I can't just claim that it's, whatever. I can't dismiss that. And so then I had to be confronted with this idea that like maybe they're not like incompatible. Maybe they can coexist. And then, going through college and taking all of these like science courses and history courses, you hear all these names of these people who developed laws and theorems and, all this stuff. And then after I became Christian and then Catholic, I realized all of those people had motivations that came from God. They believed that the world was something that we could discover because logic and reason are downstream of God. And so it was this like world opening experience for me to realize that those are not incompatible views, and that in fact most of like the great thinkers of our time were motivated because they believed that there was order and a creative designer to the universe.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And the more I dig into this topic, the more figures I discover or rediscover. I'm currently working on a manuscript uh, that I hope will be a follow up to Riddle of the Tungstones. And it is about Henri Breuil, who was a French priest and an anthropologist. He was an
There we
archaeologist. So
go.
he's somebody with my background. He studied the famous painted caves like Lascaux
Mm,
and Altamira and others on the Franco-Spanish border. And so, and he just has a very amazing story of someone who had this vocation as a priest, but also this vocation towards being a scientist. And he encountered the same thing where he was one of the greatest archaeologists of his time. And his atheist colleagues will be like, well, we can't just dismiss him because he's very smart, like
right.
the same kind of thing. So he was able to be a witness
Mm-hmm.
that he could integrate these two aspects of his life.
Mm-hmm. Oh man, I love it. I love talking about it. Staying on the topic of the faith, but kind of bringing back in that writing component, how would you say that your faith impacts your writing, or vice versa, as you've studied these, figures more and written these narrative nonfiction books? How have you seen those two interplay play out in your life?
Oh yeah, I definitely think it goes both ways. I really am trying to develop a great devotion to the Holy Spirit, who's
Mm,
always been kind of an abstract thing in my mind because
mm-hmm,
like we don't tend to use personalized images when thinking about the Holy Spirit. But I've come to notice in my own writing practice that when I do pray to the Holy Spirit, when I sit down at my keyboard or at my notebook, that the ideas do flow better, and
mm-hmm.
that I tend, if I just let Him do the work and not try to control things myself, like
Oh,
to that that it allows me to be a more authentic writer and to just let God do the work and kind of
uh-huh,
be his medium for the ideas that he wants to share with the world. Also, it's just really deepened my faith as I've gotten more interested in writing books about saints and about Catholics who made an impact on history, learning about these people and their lives has made me want to be a better Catholic, to be, a more saintly person. Word on Fire put out that spectacular series, The Pivotal Players, about saints who have impacted the history of the church. And I remember watching some of those episodes and being profoundly impacted and being like, I want what those people had, you know? So this desire to be a saint has really grown from reading and writing about them. That and finding that there are saints from and holy people from all walks of life who had all different kind of careers and all kinds of interests. I think sometimes we do ourselves a disservice by thinking of saints as just, you know, um, monks and nuns,
Right.
sometimes
Yeah.
as, the great call of Vatican II was for lay people to Christify the world, and to be great Catholic businessmen, Catholic lawyers, Catholic politicians, Catholic writers and artists, Catholic parents and neighbors, just, like we're meant to be. We recently had the reading of Being the Salt of the Earth and Light of the
Yes.
world, as we record this, that was a Sunday reading recently. And so I that is how I view what I'm doing, that if I can be the best Catholic writer that God is calling me to be, that is the way, that is in some mysterious way my path to sanctity. When I make it not just about me. And I've recently been, posting notes about this on Substack where I'm like, I think promoting my work here isn't good enough. That it can't just be that. It can't just be me promoting my book. It has to be about service somehow. It has to be about maybe helping other emerging kidlit authors like me, or someone trying to make the transition from writing something else to writing for kids, because it's not easy. Writing for kids is hard, and I'm not a fast writer anyway. And I've just found out that sometimes a kid's manuscript just needs to sit for a while. And the
Right.
ideas, need to, I call myself, I'm a gardener, not an architect. Sometimes I just have to let the seed grow. And like the scripture says, you don't know how it grows, but it does. You have to have such an economy with words
Yeah.
writing for kids, that it's not easy. It would be easier for me to pound out some huge tome. And that's I found was the hardest thing with Tonguestones, was making it accessible but also accurate,
Yeah.
and as meaty as I could make it without
Right.
overwhelming the child reader.
Right.
And it's such a skill, but I feel like with God's help, with the Holy Spirit, and through the intercession of Blessed Nicholas Steno, it happened. It all came
Yeah.
together.
As you were speaking, one of the things that I was reflecting on is I think one of the beauties of the saints, like there's several obviously beauties of the saints, having someone, for intercessory prayer and everything like that. But I think this idea that saints kind of help us bridge time. Where I was in a I was in a book club recently, and it was a Christian based book club, and we were talking about how sometimes it's so difficult to think personally about the events of the Bible because it's in a time that's so far removed from what we know and what we intimately experience. And so it's like we can know the facts of what happened, but it's hard to feel it on a personal level as if you can feel your friend telling you a story, right? And I think that grows with, maturity and humility and in the Holy Spirit. But it can be difficult, especially for newer Christians and Catholics. And I think one of the things that the saints help us do is that there's saints all throughout time. You can find more recent saints whose lives look a lot more similar to yours, and you can see that they still became saints, right? And the things that they did and what their, historical context provided for them. And so I think that's something that you were talking about, and it kind of just occurred to me. And I think that's one of the beauties of having all these saints. It's like, here's God's way of showing us that, like, these are transcendent of time, all these different examples of how the same principles carried people through no matter what historical or time period context you're in.
Oh, yeah, and I definitely found in Nicholas Steno, when I really did a deep dive into his life, a kindred spirit. Like, even though he's a guy who lived in the 1600s, I found a man who was deeply passionate about all different kinds of subjects. A man who loved to read, who loved to scribble in his notebook passages from his favorite books, a man who was interested in anatomy and fossils, and God, someone who he was raised a Lutheran, but who became a Catholic priest and eventually a bishop, someone who was serious about sanctity, but who in his earlier career as first, he trained to be a physician and then as a teacher of anatomy. And then he was always concerned with, he's like, why can't I just settle on one thing? He's like, it's going to hurt my career if I have all of these varied interests that I flip-flop between. And that's something that I've struggled with ever since college. Was like, because one of the problems with college today is that they try to shunt you into these specializations. And they're training you for the workforce. They're not trying to make you a whole, well-rounded person. So there's this prejudice against the humanities and against liberal arts, of becoming a well-rounded person with a wide variety of interests. And that's one of the messages of my book, is that I'm trying to tell kids, don't be afraid to have a ton of different interests. Don't be afraid to go on these tangents about different subjects. It worked out for Nicholas Steno. If his mind wasn't so curious and always diving after new mysteries, he wouldn't have seen the connection between his dissection of animals for anatomy and the fossils that were being dug out of the ground. He was one of the first people to really thoroughly study that connection. He's like, these weird rocks look like animal parts. Maybe they actually are. And he makes this connection, the tungstones being an ancient name for fossilized shark's teeth because of their triangular shape. And so he makes this connection that he wouldn't have seen if he didn't have this roving, curious mind. And as a person who's always struggled, where I've always felt like, I haven't arrived yet at my one thing, that it's like, maybe you don't have to. And so, that's that, like you said, like finding in the saints people who are approachable when you learn more about them is something I want to tell people, that these aren't just static images in our churches. These are,
Absolutely.
statues or paintings. These were real flesh and blood people like you and me.
Yes. And if I can hopefully accurately speak to your story a little bit, I think that roving curiosity is kind of what gave you that pivot that you needed during that time period, which your job in the museum, unfortunately, you had to put a pause on everything, right, because of the COVID. And so if you had stuck to just that career, like, you probably would have had to spend a lot more time searching for something, wait till things started opening up again. Whereas because you had fostered these roving curiosities, you were able to, like, when life threw, lemons at you, you turned it into lemonade.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I would definitely say that's true. And I even, God even made sure that there was, something museum related still waiting
Right.
for me. Like as part of the gig economy these days, I wear many hats, and one of the hats I wear now is as a history educator at a local museum here on
Aw.
Long Island, where I get to teach kids, actually, because we're a museum focused on the Revolutionary War here on Long Island, which had a lot of very interesting history. And so we get, especially at this time of year, school groups coming through every day, and I get to, practice storytelling for kids in real life with real kids. And so they have been a great blessing for me to kind of hone my skills. So it all kind of goes back then into my writing, where it's like, you know, honing that storytelling skills for this audience. So, and I definitely love all the different things that I'm able to do. It's difficult. Tax time is very complicated
I
with
bet. I bet.
yeah, but I couldn't have asked for, a a more interesting life, basically.
Beautiful. Well, I think that's a lovely place to kind of wrap up the main part of our conversation here. And I'll end with one of my favorite questions. I think it could be arguably one of the more difficult questions of the podcast, just because we all love books and it's so hard to pick. But If you have 2 or 3 book recommendations that you would love to make for our listeners, now is the time.
2 or 3 book recommended. Well, obviously, Riddle of the Tungstones.
There we go.
I mean, like, just to plug it for a little bit, I have readers who are adults and kids who love this book. And I'm also very proud of the fact that it's had wide appeal for both boys and girls. I'm very proud of that. I originally wrote it as like a boys book, but I've been very gratified that both boys and girls have loved the book and found it interesting. I know many of your listeners are probably Catholic. I would say Lord of the Rings, but I'm sure most of them have read it or at least seen the movies. Because that is honestly the other book that inspired me to like, oh, you can actually write books for a living, was Lord of the Rings when I first encountered it at 13. You know, around the time I'm going to date myself here, but around the time the movies were coming out is when I first read those books, and they just knocked me right off my feet. And I'd like to kind of also include just one more, like maybe as a narrative nonfiction book, because that's my jam, basically. Let me just think of something.
Actually, surprisingly, I don't know. I may be incorrect, but I don't think anyone has listed The Lord of the Rings yet. So that'll be a unique addition.
Oh,
I think that's
really?
yeah.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, yeah. Um, there's too many to count. I would just encourage people to explore nonfiction, because a lot of my writer friends are fiction writers, and a lot of what they read is also fiction. And so they'll tell me, I don't know how you do it, man. You read all this nonfiction. And I'm like, I think people are scared off by the textbooks that they were assigned in school. And
Yeah.
I'm like, the average book in the nonfiction section of Barnes and Noble is not like that. Most of them are narrative nonfiction because they know they have to grab people right away. One that I really loved from a few years back. If you're looking for a rip-snorting adventure story, there's a book called Lost City of the Monkey God, which sounds like a crazy title, but it's nonfiction. And the author himself went looking for lost pre-Columbian ruins in Central America and encountered all kinds of dangers and disease in the jungle. And I love stories like that. When I was a kid until now, I love adventure stories, and I love the adventure stories that are real, that really happen to people. So yeah, that's just one that just randomly came to me just now, is one from a few years ago that I remember really enjoying.
Awesome. Well, that sounds like a wonderful list. And you're right. I think a lot of the books that end up on the so I typically do like a end of season recap where I'll put all of the books that people recommend in a big list. And they all tend to be pretty fiction dominant. So I love it when people give like nonfiction recommendations as well, because I personally have like within the last year and a half really tried to like read one fiction, read one nonfiction. And what I discovered is exactly what you said, which is that I enjoy reading nonfiction now just as much as I do a fiction book. So
Oh, that's great.
I love that we can add some of that here to the list for our listeners for season 2.
Great.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. Well, Thomas, this has been so fun. I really enjoyed getting to talk to you. I love all the great perspective you brought in and the intersection of pop culture and faith and science. And I am really excited to check out your book. I know you mentioned it has equal appeal to adults and kids you found. And so I think it'll be a fun one to check out. And I look forward to seeing what you have in the future for us, too.
Oh, thanks, Grace. This has been splendid. Great conversation. I always love talking about books any chance I get.
Oh, yeah. That's why we're all here, right?
Yep.
Perfect.